Hello. If you're watching this video, you're probably interested in my kidnapping story. My name is Mark Copeland, and today I'm going to be telling you how my whole childhood was as a kidnapped child from the ages of 6 to 16, what effects it had on my life, and basically describing the events and how running away from the law, basically living on the run for 10 years was, the places we lived, how we survived. I'm going to be giving you a little backstory into my mother and father's story, just not because I know 100% of the details myself, and I don't want to rely totally on secondhand accounts, but to set up the story of the events. I will say this is very personal to me. This whole channel is about anxiety disorders, PTSD, helping people, and I thought it would help to share my story. And so I hope that you get something from this. You're probably going to notice that it is difficult for me to talk about. This is a very personal matter. I want to warn people with sensitivities that this may be upsetting to you. This whole story may be upsetting, but I'm going to push through, and I'm not going to let this stop me. I'm going to try to chapter and timestamp this because this will be a very long video. I just want to make that clear. This is my whole life story from before I was 6, setting up the events that happened, to when I was 16 and got out of the situation. And I think the after effects I'll cover in another video. But suffice it to say, I have PTSD to this day. I have been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. So this is a harder video for me to make, and you might hear me pause or, have breaks in between just to kind of gather and collect my thoughts. But let's get into it. How was I actually kidnapped? And I was actually kidnapped 3 times in the course of a custody dispute between my mother and my father. And it got very serious. It was a landmark case for international custody law. Lawyers have since told me. So yeah, it was a pretty big deal, I guess you could say. Even though I didn't realize that as a kid, and it took me a while to realize how crazy things actually were. But let's get into it. So my mother and father, my mother being Beranger and my father being Sean, met in the early 20s. My father was going to school, University of Florida, I believe, and University of Georgia, I think he did later, and he was doing an international business degree. My mother was doing a degree in France, and is since got her master's degree, and it works as a librarian, basically. Yeah, so the story basically was that my father was over at Cambridge because back in those days, this is the late 1980s, it was very commonplace for people to basically do summer internships. Like if you did an international business, you would go overseas for a couple of months to take summer courses. My mother was from France and was also going to Cambridge for some sort of summer courses over at Cambridge. So they met there. Classical story, fell in love. Two opposites, I guess you could say. And my mother and father are quite opposite. Classical story. My father went back to America. They wrote letters. They called. Everything you did in the late 80s, early 90s. There was no email, of course. So they fell in love. They got married a year or two later. Suffice it to say, the marriage was not a happy one. They had constant issues. My mother and father moved from France to the United States several times. My mother and father fought a lot on things of like, their job situations, because honestly, the economic prospects were not that good, and they could not decide where to live. So my father lived in France for several years on and off. My mother lived in America for several years. They moved back and forth constantly. At some point during this time, I was born, and this situation stabilized for a short period of time. But after I was a couple years old, my mother decided that she was not happy in the relationship with my father, and basically found another person that she wanted to spend her life with. At which point, my father and me were living in North Carolina at that current time, and my mother decided to go live with this person for a period of several months to see how things would be. my mother and father being basically separated. This is important to know. And I'm not just saying this, for no reason. I'm trying to set up what actually happened backstory wise. Now, it's very important that some of the events later on in the story, I'm going to be telling you my personal story so I can tell you this is exactly how it happened. Everything that's been relayed to me is probably tinted through either lawyer speak, my father telling me certain things, or my mother telling me certain things. So you have to understand this. I want to make that very, very clear that these preliminary events are not my own words and are actually told to me from other people simply because I was only 2 or 3 years old at the time. So I was living with my father. My mother and father had separated. My father was granted custody because my mother had moved away for several months. My mother's parents, my maternal grandparents, were not very pleased with the situation and wanted my mother to go get me because obviously they thought it was unacceptable that my mother just leave me and go live with this other man. It was something that wasn't really traditionally done in France in that older generation. So basically, my mother came back, tried to fight the courts. She was given visitation rights, but not custody in America. At which point, she actually, back then, this is pre 9/11, guys. There wasn't the security measures there are today. She actually basically kidnapped me for the first time, took me over to France, and was granted custody in France. Now you can start to see the problem. My father had custody, and my mother had done an illegal act in America, but French law is totally different. She was given custody in France, so this was a very weird scenario where my mother had custody in one country, my father had custody in another country. After consulting with lawyers, my dad was basically told that nothing could be done unless I was brought back to America because there was no real extradition laws, and my mother technically had legal custody in France. So it was kind of whoever's country the kid was in was basically how it went. My father then went and lived over for a number of years, I believe around 2 years in France, visited me. He was granted visitation rights in France. And, obviously this made the relationship between my mother and father, which was already rocky, even worse. At some point, my mother and her then boyfriend, now husband, decided to go away for a weekend. My father was given custody of me. Basically, my mother dropped me off with my father, and my father then basically we went on a boat to Morocco. Actually, went to North Africa from France. I still remember this. This is a pretty vivid memory of my early childhood, being on this rocky boat, kind of being a little seasick, and going over this boat to Morocco, and then flew back to the US. So for a while now, my father had custody. My mother was, of course, enraged. And so she flew back to America. But obviously, since she had illegally attained custody and flown me to France despite a court order in America in the first place, she wasn't taken too seriously. And for a period of a year or two, she was basically given a slap on the wrist in America, but told, listen, you're not going to get, on like visitation without a representative again for a number of years. So me and my father lived in America. We were living in North Carolina at the time. And I was living, my father had a girlfriend at that point, and her, myself, my father, and her young son all lived together in a house. And this was a period of relative stability. And I still remember a lot of good times with this lady my dad was dating at the time and her son. And it was a good period in my life. I went to preschool. I went to elementary school up to, I believe, kindergarten. This situation happened before I officially got into first grade. Eventually, however, my mother was going to be given visitation rights again, despite my father's protest, because my father feared that my mother would take me again to France. And this time, obviously, she would not leave me alone with my father again. I really don't understand how she fought to leave me in the first place, that she didn't realize my dad would do the same thing that she had done. But as you can see, the situation is already getting very messy. So my father asked me when I was very young. I still remember this. I was 6. "Well, who do you want to live with?" You have to understand that as a 6-year-old kid, I wanted to live with my father and his then girlfriend and her son. I felt more comfortable. My mother's husband, I've never liked. It's not because I dislike him as a human being. It's just that I felt weird with him when I was a kid. I still remember to this day, he had weird vibes to me. And I'm not trying to say anything against him or that he did anything wrong. I just didn't like him. And obviously, I wasn't his son. So it could be, perfectly innocuous things. But I will say this, that I did feel there was a lot of tension between him and my mother from what I remember as a young child. But these memories are vague, and I was a very young child. So, of course, I said I wanted to live with my father. And my father basically said, "Well, for that to happen, we have to go on the run because your mother is going to be given visitation rights of you. And, you know, we have to go because if she's given visitation rights without a coin appointed person there, she's going to fly you to France and I'm never going to see you again." So you can obviously see at 6 years old, this is some very, very heavy stuff to have to deal with. But I said, absolutely. And I still remember to this day, people will say maybe in the comments that I didn't know what I was doing. And in one way, I didn't. And I will be honest about that. But I did know that I wanted to live with my father because I was happy in America at that time. um, yeah. So I said I wanted to live with my father. So what proceeded to happen was my father's lawyer had told him that in a number of weeks my mother was going to be given visitation rights without a court ordered appointee. Up to this point, she had been given visitation rights, but there was always somebody there to watch my mother make sure she didn't fly back to France, basically, with me again. So, we've already had the one kidnapping of my mother kidnapping me to France. We had the kidnapping of then my father taking me from France to Morocco and from Morocco to the US. And then now we go to the big kidnapping, which was between the ages of 6 and 16. Me and my father drove from North Carolina to Baja, Mexico, to a little town called Encinitas, a little bit below Tijuana in Baja, Mexico. And this is where my crazy journey begins. So, basically what happened on the Mexico years or the year. We were able to stay in Mexico for a period of around 6 months to 1 year. It didn't last too long, and I'll get into the reasons why. But this is one of the happiest times of my life. I was going to Mexican school. Um, in terms of finances, my father had saved some money at this point, and my grandparents, which is something that I've never really let know out there, was sending us money. My grandparents did help finance basically the majority of the time between I was 6 and 16. Obviously, for many years after the situation, when the situation ended, I didn't want to say this because I did not want to get my father's parents into any trouble. They were doing the best they could and tried to help us and doing what they thought was right. Um, and I do think what they were doing was somewhat right, I guess you could say. Although, as I've aged, of course, the situation is more complicated than it may seem, but I still feel that after knowing my father and mother as an adult, I still feel like my father was more in the right than my mother. And that may be, people will say that's just because you were kidnapped by your father from age 6 to 16. I'll leave that up to your own judgment, and I'll give you the tools you can to research the case, make your own conclusions on that. So, my father and me lived in Ensenadas, Mexico. I lived in a trailer park about maybe 200 meters, 300 meters from the water, from the beach. Mexico, at this point, this would have been in about 1998 to date it, I believe, because I was 6. So, yeah, it would be about 1998. It was very cheap. You could stay for a couple $100 a month right next to the water. We were living in a trailer park. We had no freshwater showers that were private. It was literally like a communal shower that we'd get our bathing suits on and take a shower. We met a guy named Rich down there, which was a really cool gentleman. had certain legal issues in the US. And that was a very common thing down there in Ensenadas. A lot of people fled from California. They had many different legal issues and went down there to Ensenadas. Was it a place for a child to be in? Absolutely not. But it was a very exciting place for me. Which and I used to make bonfires. We used to play horseshoes down on the beach. I had a lot of good memories of this. I went to private school, which is very cheap in Mexico in those days. And so I was basically, my homework was translated to English. I learned a little bit of Spanish, but very minimally. I've always been really, really bad with languages, even though I love to travel. Um, I met a guy named, I believe his name was, I want to say Taylor, but it's been so many years. And he was the son of the couple that owned the trailer park. And the guy was a Spanish gentleman, and the woman was an American lady. They had a son, and we used to play. And I still remember us jumping on a trampoline. Like, this is a huge Mexican trampoline, like insanely dangerous. We would jump maybe 15 feet in the air, got our bodies just cut up because the edges of the trampoline where there's like metal. I mean, there was literally no regulations. This was 1998 Mexico. The guy that was in charge of the of basically Taylor's father was I believe at that point probably a methamphetamine addict. So he was, in a fur bathrobe, maybe 130 pounds, soaking wet, walking around this trailer park. So I mean, you can see this. This is right below Tijuana. Even though Ensenadas itself was a family town, there was a lot of drug use by proxy. Not that people use drugs there specifically, but they would go up to Tijuana. And that's just kind of how Mexico does things. It's a little different than in America. The police will run you out if you're in a family town doing drugs, but it's totally okay to go and use drugs in Tijuana and then come back there and things of that nature. So I played with Taylor, and Taylor was very instrumental in that situation because his mother would be the one that eventually turned us into the police. She saw a wanted poster in Mexico of me because we had just been gone. The court ordered, the court issued, once my dad didn't show up to court, the court figured out pretty quickly that my dad had run away with me. There was wanted posters of me. I was on milk bottles and everything of that nature. So, yeah, it was something that was kind of crazy. But yeah, that was something that definitely happened. And, I have a lot of memories there. There was I would say not like a bullying situation that happened, but there was some things that I got in altercations with a boy named Fernando when I was there, and that was kind of the start of my I would call it maybe antisocial tendencies. I had some altercations with a boy named Fernando. I also had a deep fear, even being this young, I had a very, very deep fear of being left alone. So my dad one day drove us up into the mountains. We were just driving around. This was a weekend. And my dad decided to hide behind some stones just for whatever reason. He decided to hide. Was it a good idea? No, it wasn't. But I was a young child. I completely freaked out. I started screaming, crying, trying to see where he had gone. Maybe he hid for like 5 minutes and then came out and said, "Hey, it was all a joke. I'm sorry. It was just a practical joke." I was just seeing red. That's all I could say. I was so emotionally distraught. It's hard for me to put into words my emotions. But I actually took a rock, and when my dad was walking away, I threw the rock and hit him in the head, and he was knocked semi unconscious. Luckily, he survived. I think he had to go for like mild medical treatment, but he used a fake name and everything, obviously. Um, but this is the type of fear that became my current day PTSD, my current day generalized anxiety. I still to this day fear being alone quite often. And it is difficult. It is difficult. I feel like My chest is being crushed. It feels like I'm going to die if I'm left alone for any period of time. So this was the first kind of situation where this started to manifest, the stress of the situation. And I knew we were living on the run in Mexico. I would go to children's birthday parties in the days, and in the weekends, I would, smash pinatas open. I was invited to kids' houses. We would eat ice cream after school. There was like an ice cream truck that was there in Ensenadas right after school. So a lot of things were very daily life and looked idyllic, but definitely living on the run, constantly having to have a fake name. My fake name was James. So, I still to this day feel kind of like James is my real name, not Mark. Um, but yeah, it was a very traumatic experience. That lying, constantly lying to people, became difficult the more time that went by. So, over the course of the 6 months to a year, I lived a fairly normal life while we were living in this trailer park in Ensenadas. However, this all came to a crashing end. The owner of the trailer park approached my dad one day and said, "Listen, my wife seen your son on a wanted poster, and I didn't know what to say, but I wanted to tell you." So he told my dad this, that his wife had basically reported us to the police. Now, because of U.S. Mexican extradition and U.S. authorities having to contact Mexico and everything, my dad and I were basically able to escape, go up to the border. He bought me this ridiculously oversized Mexican sombrero. And this was before 9/11. So we were basically able to just walk back into America. At which point, my dad and me had to figure out something else to do because we had just avoided being caught by like literally maybe a day or less. So yeah, it's that was the first really close run in we had with the law. So my dad contacted my grandparents at this point, and my grandfather knew a gentleman um, up in Idaho, and that's where we moved to next. Now, between this period of time, we actually lived for several weeks in Reno and Las Vegas, Nevada. My dad was very despondent at this time, very depressed, almost suicidal. He almost turned himself in at this point because, the Mexico experience was supposed to be a new life for us. It was supposed to be us having a normal life. And at this point, I think my father realized that that was impossible with how young I was. And looking back, maybe we did it exactly the opposite. I think if I looked back at it, we probably should have tried to do what we did later in the beginning and then done what we did in the beginning at the end. But, my father was no genius with it. He was a smart guy, but he had never really done illegal things. He didn't want to get in this situation, and it's just something that happened. I was a kid. I was very gung ho. Surprisingly, until I was about 16, for me, it felt like an adventure. It felt exciting at that time. And that's probably just me not fully understanding all the ramifications, I guess you could say. So yeah, so I was you know, I was one of those kids where I really felt gung ho about it. I felt like there was something special. Like this made me special, I guess. So we lived in Nevada for a period of several weeks, and my grandparents contacted this gentleman up in Idaho that they knew, and we went to live out on a ranch in Idaho with a gentleman. I'll just call him. Let's call him Thomas. So we lived with this gentleman, Thomas. I don't want to get him involved. I know it's many years after the fact, but I will be obfuscating certain names here just to not get people that could get in trouble into trouble. And I don't know if they want their involvement known. So we went to live up with Thomas, and Thomas had a ranch up in Idaho. He was a rancher, and my life was again semi-normal. The big difference here was I did not go to school. I started being homeschooled, and from this point, I was homeschooled from the period of now, basically when I believe this was 6.5 or 7. Probably I would be 7 at this point, all the way to when I was 16. So my dad did do some elementary school teaching in France and do some tutoring in France, that kind of thing. So, he got homeschool materials. I was taught in the daytime, and that's basically how my schooling went. When we lived on this ranch, we would go and feed cows. We had pheasants. We had a large amount of land. I had three wheelers and four wheelers to drive. For a kid, it was an adventure. And, going from below Tijuana, Mexico, very subtropical environment, to now Idaho, where it gets very cold in the winter. It was an exciting experience for a kid. I love the animals. I love petting the cows. We had chickens. It seemed exciting at the time. The guy Thomas that we were living with was a little bit of a coarse gentleman, but a really good guy. He had worked in the mines for many years, and he had inherited his family's ranch. His father and mother had died, and his brother was in a hospital for the mentally disabled. And he was just a very, very good gentleman. I have a lot of good things to say. But he did teach me some bad habits. As common with ranching and mining. I first started to learn curse words and everything, and so my dad didn't like that. But our time was fairly happy in Idaho, and Thomas, it was a good period in my life. I still remember, some things that are a little disturbing for kids. Like, I first got to see animals branded. I got to see kind of how ranch life is and how hard farm life and ranch life is. The mortgage payments and everything that ranchers and farmers have to go through on a yearly basis, and how humbling that life is, how hard they have to work. But I love the hard work, and it's very mentally unstressful. I felt very happy in Idaho. I felt very free. When you're just driving around these hundreds of acres, it feels very good. I also had several pet bunnies at that time, but just due to my own bad caretaking, they didn't survive very long. And so that was a little bit difficult for me. I always wanted to have dogs when I was a kid. And eventually, me and my father would get dogs, to some tragic endings, I guess you could say. But we'll get to that in a moment. So, Idaho, how did it end? What happened? Well, about 6 months after we got to Idaho, 9 months, probably even less than in Mexico, one of Thomas's friends invited us to dinner, and his wife had also seen me, surprise, surprise, again on a wanted poster. I believe this is 99, I want to say, or yeah, this would be like 90, late 98, 99. I think sometime in 99. And so there was like primitive internet. This was like AOL stuff. So she had seen me on one of these like missing websites, because my face was out there a lot at the time. I've even had people message me emails later on in my life about like my face was on the back of like like the matchbook cars, like the cars for kids, like for like children, and I guess milk bottles, whatever. In Walmart, I know that I've had several people send me emails of my face being up in Walmart. So she found this, she recognized me, and she called the police, or was going to call the police. And just again, her husband basically told Thomas, which then told my dad. And so we had to leave in a hurry, much, much faster this time, because really it was inside of the US. So as soon as the police were called, I mean, we would have been found. So I don't know how Thomas knew in time, but we had to leave again. So we've almost been caught 2 times already, and it's been maybe a year and a half out of 10. So it doesn't seem like me and my dad were doing too well. And so my dad and my grandfather at the time, Barry, my paternal grandfather, hatched a plan to, let's live out in the wilderness. Now, 2 sites were basically thought up of this. One was because my grandparents had a Harley Davidson leather business. They sold leather products across the U.S. One was in Arkansas, and one was in Alaska. Luckily for me, because I've later been to Alaska in my life, they chose Arkansas. So we got a little place, a little wooden shack out in the country, near Conway, Arkansas. and we lived out there for about 3 years. And so my life in Arkansas was radically different than anything that had come before. Where beforehand, I would say my life had some normality because I was interacting with people. Um, Now my grandparents would come. We would buy food every month. We had found a guy's license basically, and my dad had basically cut his hair. We had literally found a license on the street. As surprising as that sound, we had found the guy's license on the street. My dad didn't want to drive very much because he was fearing that's how he would be caught by the police. My grandparents would come around every month and we would go get food. And we just had a massive freezer. We lived in this little wooden shack out in the middle of Arkansas, in the middle of nowhere. I did homeschooling during the day. And so I had no interaction. This is when I'm 7 to around 10 years old. I had no interaction with other children for 3 years. I would see other people once a month when we went out to town. And, my companions were, a Game Boy, the original Game Boy, not even the color, books. So, like, I started reading Harry Potter. I remember I read the first Harry Potter. That was the first book I ever read by myself. And yeah, it was literally that. Later on, about a year in, my dad actually bought me a dog. We went and bought a Labrador Retriever. So I got my first dog named Sammy. And I love Sammy a lot. And to be honest with you, part of the reason that I survived today and am here talking to you and describing my life story is because of my dogs. And I have to really give it to that. Is like when you're by yourself, they say that leaving people by themselves and isolating them from people is now deemed torture, by a lot of places. And I can say that's true. Like, I can't imagine those people that are put in solitary in prison. You start talking to yourself, guys. That's the reality of what happens. And I will tell you that I did. I would talk to myself all the time. Um, there was some definitely questionable decisions that happened. I'll say it that way. I love my dad. Me and him still have a great relationship. My grandfather and my dad, I think, catered a little bit to me because they wanted to try to make me as happy as they could. But some of the stuff, wasn't healthy, obviously. There was no better option. Um, I was lucky because my grandparents at this point was still financially well enough where I got luxury goods. Like, I had bought like a PlayStation 2 at this point. I had a Game Boy. I had things to entertain myself as a kid, but having no social interaction started to mount up. We were living in a cabin in Arkansas. Food would oftentimes go scarce because my grandparents would be coming very infrequently, like 1+ month. So sometimes we would eat most of our foods and be literally on green beans and like one meal a day by the end, where we were gorging ourselves at the beginning. And this would only get worse over the years. Um, we went to the bathroom out in an outhouse. We chopped wood for a wood fireplace. We had a wooden stove. So we literally had, you could cook food on like a wooden oven. And we also had like a propane tank, small little burner oven. And it was a very, very rugged rural experience. And my best memories are playing with my dog Sammy and basically, you know, living as a kid, Game Boy. I still remember PS2 booting it up for the first time, playing Pokemon Blue and Red, and I drifted far into my imagination here. I thought that I was going to get Pikachu for Christmas. I mean, looking back on it, I think my mind was trying to shelter me from the reality of the situation, which was very harsh and very real, and a lot of the loneliness that I was experiencing on a daily basis, which was very unhealthy. Very, very, very unhealthy. So that went on for 3 years, and it gradually got worse. My grandparents had a large amount of money stolen from them, about $50,000 or so, at one of these level shows, and it may have even been more. It may have been like 80,000. They also got in trouble with the IRS because they were kind of not great at running their own business, and they didn't go to business school. They just had started the business, I believe, in the late 60s or early 70s, done really well for a while, but got in trouble with the IRS, so the money started to dry up, and so that made it very difficult on my father and I. Um, and later, a guy had moved in closer to our cabin. He was an older gentleman, had retired, and was going to move really close to our house. At this point, my dad became paranoid. He became very scared that this guy would basically call the police on us because he would realize that there's a kid living up there that isn't going to school. And maybe he would think my dad was, I don't know, abusing me, which, just by the way, my dad never did abuse me. There was nothing, there was no sort of abuse, but I want to say that just to make it absolutely clear. But my dad was paranoid that this guy would find out and call the police. So when I was around 10 years old, we moved from Arkansas in this little wooden shack we were living in out to New Mexico. So this was outside of Socorro, New Mexico, where we lived next, about 70 miles out. It very, very rural. This actually was way more rural than even the place that we had lived near Conway. And we lived in a trailer at first. And then my dad actually built a stucco building. He actually constructed a building, him and my grandfather, but mainly my father. He just flew up basically a shack to live in. And I mean, this was even harder in almost every way from when we were in Arkansas. There would be months here where I would not see another human being other than my father. My father was paranoid, especially as the years got later. He became more paranoid that if I was seen at town or if we were stopped when my dad was in the car, we would be turned in. So I did go to town sometimes, but it became more infrequent. When my dad would leave me for a period of several hours, I still remember I was playing Dark Cloud 2 on the PS2, and I still remember this. I remember the first tremors and shakes, which are very common now as an adult. But this is the first thing that kind of manifested of my PTSD. Anytime I'm left alone, it's very hard for me. And I feel like the walls are closing in. I feel like my heart is getting crushed. I'm very, very lucky today to have a very understanding wife that helps me immensely. So I really am thankful for that. But, um, it was a difficult situation. It was a very difficult situation. While we were living in New Mexico, I grew up. We actually had gotten another dog. So we had Sammy, and then we had another golden retriever, Goldie. And these two dogs were my life. They kept me kind of sane. But the talking to myself intensified. And this was the first period in my life when I was maybe around 11 or 12 that I had really got into a depression to where I was thinking about, I don't know how long I can do this, and that I feel depressed. I feel hopeless because we would go without food sometimes now. My grandparents had started to really run into financial troubles. The business wasn't doing as well. They were living in California at the time. And so they would come out maybe once a month to New Mexico. The money was always a problem. We got less and less money. I mean, sometimes, and then there was frivolous spending. I mean, I guess my dad and my grandfather, to try to placate me, to try to make me happier, we had even bought a horse that was like completely useless and was silly. So you can kind of see that, they did their best to try to make the situation bearable, but ultimately we had food insecurity. I had been very far away now for children for a period of like around 5 to 6 years. Um, I was becoming a little bit rebellious in my teenage years as well. I definitely I felt really depressed in certain periods of that time. And looking back, New Mexico was a very hard period in my life. Um, there was some really great memories. I remember drinking coffee for the first time there. I remember, exploring New Mexico, the beautiful sunsets. Seeing where the like solar rays were near Magdalena. Me and my dad went and did camping many times in New Mexico, and I have a lot of fond memories with my father. But it was a difficult time in my life, and the isolation, I was talking to myself on a daily basis now. I still remember muttering to myself, and like I would have these different voices in my mind. And for somebody that hasn't been in that situation, that sounds crazy, but it's just something you do to cope. that you split your personality into multiple people, and then one person kind of talks to the other person. And that allows you to have some semblance of communication, at least an internal communication. And we were very poor. I would run around 30-degree weather with shorts. I still remember that, and like a baggy t-shirt with holes in it. We cut firewood for heat. It was difficult. It was very financially difficult. I remember being hungry many times during these years. The food insecurity, when I would get food, I still to this day have a problem with that. I just shovel food down unless I'm really consciously thinking about it, because we had constant food insecurity in these years. Fast forward to the end of this period, and my grandparents eventually said, listen, we cannot keep making New Mexico work. It's too far of a drive. We're financially just, it's too difficult. So my dad decided, let's go to California. So I was actually sent out first. And over a period of months, my dad and me finally moved to California. It was me first, and then we would come back for a bit because we were still trying to get all of our assets and stuff sold in New Mexico and trying to figure out how exactly it would work. And my grandparents were living in a little place in Oceanside, California, which was not as expensive as it is today. But I fell instantly in love in California. I was already watching the OC, which was like a teen drama in the early 2000s about California. And to this day, California is still my favorite state. I love California. Went down to Southern California, went to the beach for the first time, just fell in love. I felt like I was back in Mexico, which was one of the happiest parts of my childhood. I was able to interact with other children. They signed me up for Grandmaster Chun's Taekwondo. And so San Marcos, California, for those wondering. I went to martial arts for the first time in my life, which was a real game changer for me. It really helped me to cope with a lot of my mental issues. It gave me discipline. I would go like 2 hours, 2.5 hours a day. So a lot every day, like every day of the week. And I loved it. It was super positive for me. And I owe a lot to Grandmaster Chun. I owe a lot to Taekwondo in general. And at this point, I had gotten the crazy idea that I wanted to be a professional fighter, that I wanted to fight in the UFC, MMA. So I did that. I tried to learn jujitsu on the side, Ninth Planet Jiu-Jitsu, if anybody out there knows what that's about, by Eddie Bravo. Yeah, so I got really big into that. I would torrent and like download, like, back then on like illegal file sharing websites, like I would download like MMA shows, like the UFCs, the first UFCs, all of that stuff, just being a kid, not knowing any better. This is the early 2000s, we're in an illegal situation here. So stuff that I wouldn't really say, is good to do, but, we had no access to money. We had no access to resources. And I mean, I guess my dad thought, well, I'm already got kidnapped the kids. So, what's the worst they can do to me at this point? They're not going to get me for file sharing and stuff. So that was the situation that happened in California. I went there and we lived in California for around 2 years. So New Mexico was between the years of about 10 to 13. And then California was right around when I was like 12 and a half, 13 and onwards for about 1.5, 2 years. And honestly, this was my happiest time in my life. I had met other children. I interacted with them in Taekwondo, had my first crushes, just kind of experienced life as a normal kid. Now, this being said, I still had to use my altered name. I was always James. I couldn't go to a regular school because obviously they would ask for social security numbers, etc., etc. So it's important to know that even though I was living a more normal life, I was constantly living a lie this entire time. My grandparents tried to do real estate out in California. That did not work. So financially, things became harder and harder. My dad and my grandfather tried to restore and sell Volkswagen Beetles, which did generate some income. But after a period of time, finances got harder. We moved out of Oceanside and we moved into a trailer park in Escondido, California. This is where a lot of problems started. The trailer park, the person right next to it was an abusive guy. He would beat his wife, beat his kids. There was just a lot of negativity in the trailer parks. And personally, I hate trailer parks to this day. I hate trailers in general, because I just associate it with a lot of negative things. Another problem was our dogs, which were still fairly large dogs and had lived their life in isolations, were seen as aggressive to other people because they were like guard dogs. Like we had lived 3 years in Arkansas, 3 years in New Mexico, so we had lived a long period of time where these dogs were meant to alert us if somebody was coming onto the property. Because my dad was very suspicious of people coming on the property. So, they didn't deal well with others. I'll say it that way. And I love them so much. I love Goldie. I love Sammy. But the trailer park eventually said, hey, your dogs have been barking at people. They've been seen as aggressive. We need you to get them off the property. So my dad and me didn't have any other choice. We chained them up about a mile away and we would go. I would actually walk there and we would go and feed them. I would feed them and water them. And we were trying to figure out what are we going to do, because how are we going to care for our dogs now and what can we do? And so we tried to give away our dogs for adoption. This was heartbreaking. I still remember just sobbing, breaking down, crying. But it did not work. The adoption agency, like where we went, the Humane Society, basically called us the same day and said, listen, they have too much aggressive behavior. You have to take them back or we're going to euthanize them. So we took them back. We kept them away from this trailer park from like a mile. I would walk there. And one day when I walked to where they were at, I found them killed. This was one of the most disturbing things in my life. I still remember walking up to my dogs and people were just taking shotgun shells and basically killed both of my dogs. Their bodies and carcasses were just destroyed. So this is a 13-year-old kid. I had already had a lot of mental stress from the situation, from living in isolation. Imagine this. This is two of your closest companions, people, individuals like dogs that you had lived with for 6 years, and they've just been brutally murdered. And I mean, I can still remember in my mind the images just like they were yesterday. So I walk back, and I still remember this is where I really feel like I fractured as a person a little bit, and I definitely got some things that were not healthy in me, because I still remember walking back to my dad, and I told him, Dad, listen, I need to go tell you something. And I remember my voice being super calm, super cold, and like I had no emotion. My emotion was just completely obfuscated. I felt like I was like an assassin or something, somebody that was totally detached from reality. And I told him, Dad, listen, I need to go tell you something, and it's going to be hard to hear. And he's like, what is it? What's going on? And I told him, Sammy and Goldie have been shot. They've been killed. And so, we buried them. And from this point on, things became rougher and rougher. Eventually, it was deemed that California wasn't viable financially for my grandparents. And at this point, we were pretty much entirely financially dependent on them. So we went and lived in a place in Georgia with one of my grandfather's friends again. So very similar to Idaho, but now in Georgia. We did technically live with my grandparents for a very short period of time in Georgia when they had just moved to Georgia, because they also had moved to Georgia at this point. So but it didn't work out for various reasons. My grandparents, we don't know, but there was a fear, and it could have just been total paranoia that we had been reported to the police. So my grandparents set us up in this place again, and we lived with this guy. Let's just call this guy Jack. Jack was absolutely insane. He was a pillhead. He was on opiates. He was on stimulants. He had mental issues, let's just say that. And Jack would tell us to do crazy things. He had this property. We lived in a trailer. Again, my hatred of trailers. We lived on this trailer a little bit outside of Athens, Georgia. And he would tell us to, move stuff, move this from this place to another place. He was very verbally abusive to both me and my father, specifically to my father, especially. And he was very unpredictable. And I hated living there. I absolutely hated living there. And we lived there for about 6 to 9 months. And at this point, I'd been taken away. I couldn't no longer go to martial arts. So that had been taken away from me. So I fell into bodybuilding, I fell into weightlifting, and that's really all that I could kind of express my anger and frustration at this situation in. And so it was a very dark time. I felt depressed on a daily basis. It was terrible. And this guy Jack was insane. He would come over. Sometimes he wouldn't come over for a week or two. Sometimes he would come over and he would threaten us too. Like he would be like, "Well, if you don't do this, kind of threatening that he'll kick us out." So my dad was always on eggshells. He told me, you have to really be careful around Jack because he will basically throw us out, and then we are completely SOL. We have nowhere else to go. My grandparents were also very stingy on the money, which is very understandable. They had been financing us now for 8, 9 years, and they had retired at this point, and they were just running out of money. So my grandfather came one day and told us, "Listen, we have to turn ourselves in." And he had been talking to a marshal at this point for a number of years called Forrest, and this marshal basically was trying to get the case, and thank God for Forrest. I really, to this day, am so grateful for him. He was trying to negotiate a peaceful end to the situation and basically have my dad face no charges. There's a lot of things that I don't want to say like in a negative way, but a lot of people had a negative outlook on my mother. They felt that she was abusing the case for monetary gain. I know that through a number of websites, my mother raised a lot of money to look for me, supposedly. And I know she also did hire private investigators, and some of this money was used to look for me, but a large amount of it, many people had said, were used to kind of finance her personal projects or personal goals, whatever you want to say. Um, so yeah, Forrest and a lot of people in the American judicial system did not have a very good opinion of my mother, and they were pretty clear about that. So they didn't really view my father as being totally in the wrong, even though he had broken US laws. And so they wanted to basically negotiate a situation where we could exit. And there was a lot of struggles with this. It took around a year, from the period of when I was about 15 and living in Georgia to when I was about 16. And then eventually the legal situation was able to end. We were able to turn ourselves in at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, which is basically where we started in North Carolina. There's a lot of rumors here. I know my mother was the sheriff had changed hands over the course of this 10 years, and apparently one of the deputies in this older sheriff's station was said purportedly as a rumor to have been having a relationship with my mother. There was a lot of rumors going around, and the sheriff that was in charge when we came back was much more sympathetic to my case than the older sheriff had been. So I was really grateful to him, really grateful to Forrest and the Marshal Service from the U.S. government, the federal government. I think they did a great job, and thank God the whole situation was de-escalated. My father luckily did not have to spend any time in prison, and from 6 to 16, we basically lived on the run, and that's kind of what these years were about. And then at the age of 16, we turned ourselves in. And, I thought everything was going to be all sunshine and rainbows. And I think that's something that is one of the reasons I'm making this video, because that is very, very far from the truth. A lot of people that have been kidnapped, they don't get mental help after the fact. And I want to make that 100% clear. I thought I could go to therapy. I thought that people would help me to recover from this situation. I thought that, because at this point I'd started to realize a little bit that some of the things was feeling was not normal. But I can tell you from direct experience, that's not what happens. You were let back into society and you're told, okay, now you should function as a functional member of society and just go about your everyday life. And I never got counseling. I never got therapy, none of that. My mother was never that involved, I guess, because she had already made the money off of it and written me off many years before. And it was just a bad situation when I came back. I felt into depression. We lived with my grandparents in their house in North Carolina, and I didn't know how to associate with people. I hadn't really associated with people for most of these 10 years. And a lot of the stuff that started to come about was, that delayed PTSD. I didn't notice it at first, but I started having nightmares. I started waking up sweating, shaking. Um, at that time, I was able to control myself somewhat, but in my early 20s, it actually became worse, and I began to have panic attacks. And suffice it to say that over the course of the situation, I developed a lot of bad habits, not loving myself, not thinking that I was a good person, um, thinking I was trash, that kind of stuff that influenced my later life. And I want to break this up. I'm going to do another video later talking about what happened from the ages of, let's say, 16 to 26, and all the troubles I had, all the addictions I fell into, all of the, all the issues I had from a social perspective, and some of the things that helped me to kind of correct my life when I was about 25, 26, meet my wife, start living a normal life, I guess you could say, and start realizing a lot of the trauma that had happened to me. But that's for another video. I want in the video comments, I really want you guys to just put out any questions you have. I would be happy to answer the situation. I'm sure people are curious about what it's like to live on the run for 10 years. It's like being a criminal. It's like being a gangster or something. You're always looking over your shoulder. Still to this day, when I see a police car, I jump. I get nervous. I sweat whenever I see a police officer. You just learn to do things in a shady way. You definitely meet with a lot of shady characters, and it affects you in every part of your life when you do things like that. And the social isolation is extremely impactful mentally after a period of time, and it's insidious because you don't realize it immediately, but the effects is tremendous. And so, like I said, the second part of this video will basically talk about the effects of my life, what happened after I was 16, trying to get into school, how that didn't work out, my first relationship, the disaster there. But I wanted to keep this video about my years from 6 to 16. I'm going to be doing an AMA also about this so people can kind of ask questions. And then in the comments, I really want to just answer any and all questions. Part of what I'm doing this for is because I haven't talked about this. I'm 31 years old now. I really want to help people that have been kidnapped, that have been in a custody situation. I want to help them to recover. And I want to say to you, listen, it's okay. I've been through this. I understand, maybe people haven't helped you the way they should have. Maybe they haven't told you that it's okay to have PTSD about this. But yeah, it was an incredibly traumatic experience. It was an incredibly abnormal childhood that I deemed as being okay and normal for many years because I didn't know any better. So I hope you like this video. One thing you could really do is share this video with one person, hit the like button. This whole channel, That Anxious Gamer, is about helping people with anxiety conditions. It may seem like a gaming channel, but that's just one part of it. I've done horror games to try to help people overcome, because I used to have panic attacks, horrible panic attacks from playing any sort of scary game. Some scary movies would trigger this, where I would be shaking, thinking I was going to have a heart attack, die. This is about me being totally open and explaining my past and being totally transparent. And I want to answer any and all questions in the comments, and I want to really ask you guys to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you want to, even though the majority of this content will be gaming content, but it'll be a lot of anxiety related content as well. But ultimately, if you could like and share the video, that would help me out so much. I really hope to help other people, other kidnapped children. I know a lot of people through sexual abuse, through a lot of physical abuse. A lot of people had it much worse than me. And I want to make that clear that I'm not trying to victimize myself. I'm not trying to say that I had it the worst of everybody. My dad was quite good to me, but I want to say, hey, it's okay. Whatever your experience was, we're all in this together. And I just wanted to be totally open and frank about my childhood and what it was like living on the run for 10 years and living as a fugitive. So, yeah, definitely leave me some comments below. I'll try to answer every single one. Really hope you like this video. Hit the like and share this video if you could. Thank you guys so much.